The words hung in the air between them like a confession Frank Diaz had been holding back for months. "I miss how we used to talk," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, and now he sat close enough that their shoulders touched on the small couch in his apartment. The warmth radiating from his body made Tyler Carter's heart race in ways he couldn't quite understand, couldn't quite name, but couldn't deny anymore. Tyler's breath caught as Frank shifted slightly, their thighs now pressing together through the thin fabric of their jeans. The television flickered with some forgotten movie neither of them was watching, casting dancing shadows across Frank's face as he stared down at his hands. Those hands that Tyler had watched countless times as they gestured while Frank talked, hands that had brushed against his own during shared meals and late-night conversations, hands that now trembled slightly as they rested on his knees. "Frank," Tyler whispered, and the sound of his own voice surprised him with its tenderness, its vulnerability. He watched as Frank's eyes fluttered closed for just a moment, as if the sound of his name, spoken so softly, was almost too much to bear. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the space between them charged with an electricity that Tyler had been trying to ignore for weeks. Every conversation they'd had lately seemed to circle around something unspoken, something that lived in the spaces between words and in the lingering glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. Tyler had caught himself studying the curve of Frank's mouth when he laughed, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, cataloging every expression like he was trying to solve some impossible equation. "I know you miss it," Tyler said finally, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I miss it too, but I think we both know why things changed." Frank's shoulder pressed more firmly against his, and Tyler felt a subtle shift like an earthquake in his chest. They had been dancing around this moment for so long that Tyler had almost convinced himself it would never come, that they would continue existing in this strange liminal space forever, neither friends nor something more, suspended in uncertainty. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, sitting so close that Tyler could count Frank's eyelashes and feel each breath he took, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Tyler Carter thought he understood exactly who he was and what he wanted. Back when Frank Diaz was just his roommate's annoying friend who left coffee rings on the kitchen table and played music too loud on Sunday mornings. 3 months earlier, Tyler had been dating Sandra Perez, a marketing executive with perfectly styled hair and a laugh that sounded like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. Their relationship had been the kind that looked good on paper, the kind that made sense to everyone around them, the kind that felt like playing a role in a play he'd never auditioned for. "You're distracted again," Sandra had said one evening over dinner at an expensive restaurant Tyler couldn't really afford. She'd been cutting her salmon into precise, identical pieces, each movement deliberate and controlled. "You've been distracted for weeks." Tyler had looked up from his untouched pasta, realizing she was right. He had been distracted, but not in the way she thought. His mind kept wandering to conversations he'd overheard between his roommate Jacob Jones and Frank. Conversations about books and movies and ideas that made Tyler want to join in, want to share his own thoughts, want to be part of something that felt real and unscripted. "I'm sorry," he'd said, reaching across the table to take Sandra's hand. Her fingers felt cold against his, perfectly manicured, but somehow lifeless. "Work has been crazy." But it wasn't work that had been occupying his thoughts. It was the way Frank had looked when he'd found Tyler reading in the kitchen one morning, the surprise and interest in his eyes when he'd seen the book Tyler was holding. It was the conversation that had followed, meandering and easy, about literature and philosophy and dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. It was the way Frank had leaned against the counter, coffee mug cradled in his hands, completely focused on every word Tyler said like it mattered, like Tyler mattered. Sandra had squeezed his hand and smiled, but the gesture felt hollow. "Maybe we should take a vacation," she'd suggested, "get away from all the stress." Tyler had nodded and agreed, but even as he did, he found himself thinking about how Frank had laughed at something he'd said that morning, a genuine sound of delight that had made Tyler's chest feel warm and light. He'd found himself wondering what it would be like to travel with someone who looked at the world the way Frank did, with curiosity and wonder instead of the calculating assessment that Sandra brought to everything. That night, lying next to Sandra in her pristine bedroom with its white walls and expensive sheets, Tyler had stared at the ceiling and tried to understand why he felt so empty. She was beautiful, successful, everything he was supposed to want. But when she'd reached for him in the darkness, when she'd kissed him with practiced precision, all he could think about was the way Frank's eyes had lingered on his mouth during their kitchen conversation, the way his voice had dropped to something softer and more intimate when they'd talked about books they'd loved. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't thinking about Sandra when she kissed him. He was thinking about Frank. The next morning, Tyler had ended things with Sandra as gently as he could, citing stress and timing and all the usual excuses people used when they couldn't explain that they'd discovered something fundamental about themselves that changed everything. She'd been disappointed but not devastated, which somehow made Tyler feel even worse about the whole situation. "I think I knew," she'd said as she gathered her things from his apartment. "You've been somewhere else for a while now." After she left, Tyler had sat in his empty living room and tried to process what was happening to him. He'd dated women exclusively for 26 years. He'd never questioned his sexuality, never wondered if there was something else he was supposed to be feeling. But now, with Sandra's perfume still lingering in the air and her absence creating a relief he hadn't expected, Tyler found himself confronting the possibility that everything he'd thought he knew about himself might be wrong. That's when Frank had knocked on his door. "Jacob said Sandra left looking upset," Frank had said, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Wanted to make sure you were okay." Tyler had looked at him, standing there, genuine concern written across his features, and felt something shift inside his chest. Frank was wearing a faded t-shirt that brought out the green in his eyes, his dark hair slightly messed from the wind, and Tyler had the strangest urge to reach out and smooth it down. "I'm fine," Tyler had said, but his voice had cracked slightly on the words. It wasn't working." Frank had nodded and stepped into the apartment without being invited, settling onto the couch like he belonged there. "Want to talk about it?" And somehow Tyler had found himself talking. Not about Sandra specifically, but about feeling like he was going through the motions of his life, about relationships that felt performative rather than real, about the growing sense that he was missing something fundamental about himself. Frank had listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that made Tyler think deeper about his own feelings. There had been something in the way Frank looked at him during that conversation, something that made Tyler's skin feel warm and his heart race in ways that Sandra's touch never had. "Maybe you're just not ready to settle down," Frank had suggested, but there had been something careful in his voice, like he was testing the waters of a deeper conversation. "Maybe," Tyler had agreed, but even as he said it, he'd been thinking that it wasn't about settling down. It was about settling for something that didn't feel right, something that didn't make his pace quicken or his thoughts scatter the way they did when Frank smiled at him. That conversation had been the beginning of something Tyler couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, Frank had started spending more time at the apartment, ostensibly to hang out with Jacob, but somehow always ending up in conversations with Tyler. They talk about books and movies, about their games and their dreams, about philosophy and art and all, the things that Tyler had never been able to discuss with Sandra. Frank had a way of listening that made Tyler feel like every word he spoke was important, like his thoughts and opinions mattered in ways they never had before. When Tyler talked about his job at the marketing firm, Frank asked questions that showed he was really paying attention, that he cared about Tyler's satisfaction and happiness in ways that went beyond polite interest. "You don't sound happy when you talk about work," Frank had observed one evening as they sat in the kitchen sharing a pizza Jacob had abandoned for a date. "When was the last time you did something that actually excited you?" Tyler had paused with a slice of pizza halfway to his mouth, struck by the question. "I don't know," he'd admitted. "I used to write back in college, stories mostly, but that's not exactly a practical career choice." "Who says it has to be practical?" Frank had asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "What kind of stories did you write?" And Tyler had found himself talking about his writing for the first time in years, about the characters that lived in his head and the worlds he'd created on paper. Frank had listened with rapt attention, asking questions about plot and character development. encouraging Tyler to share details about stories he thought no one would ever want to hear about. "You should start writing again," Frank had said when Tyler finally finished talking. "I'd love to read something you've written." The offer had sent a warm flush through Tyler's chest. No one had ever expressed interest in his writing before, not even Sandra, who had dismissed it as a hobby he should have outgrown. But Frank's enthusiasm felt genuine, like he really did want to understand this part of Tyler that he'd kept hidden for so long. That night, Tyler had dug out his old laptop and opened a new document. For the first time in months, words had flowed from his fingers like water. A story about two people who found each other in unexpected ways, who discovered parts of themselves they'd never known existed. He'd written until dawn, fueled by the memory of Frank's encouraging smile and the way his eyes had lit up when Tyler talked about his passion for storytelling. The next evening, Frank had asked about his writing, and Tyler had shyly admitted that he'd started a new story. Without hesitation, Frank had asked to read it, and Tyler had found himself emailing the first chapter before he could lose his nerve. Frank's response had come back within an hour, full of thoughtful commentary and genuine praise that made Tyler's heart race. "This is incredible," Frank had written. "Your characters feel so real, so complex. I can't wait to see what happens next." That exchange had opened something between them, a new level of intimacy that went beyond casual friendship. Frank had started texting Tyler throughout the day, sharing random thoughts and observations that made Tyler smile at inappropriate moments during work meetings. Tyler had found himself looking forward to these messages more than anything else in his day, crafting careful responses that he hoped would make Frank laugh or think or feel the same warm connection that Tyler felt whenever his phone buzzed with a new text. Their conversations had grown longer and more personal. Frank had shared stories about his childhood, about the pressure he'd felt to follow his father's footsteps into law before finally pursuing his passion for graphic design. Tyler had talked about his own family, about the expectations he'd always felt to live a certain kind of life, to want certain kinds of things, even when those things didn't feel right to him. "I think we all spend too much time trying to be who we think we're supposed to be," Frank had said one night, as they sat on the apartment's small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine Jacob had left behind, "instead of figuring out who we actually are." Tyler had looked at Frank in the dim light from the kitchen window, noting the way the shadows played across his features, the thoughtful expression in his eyes. "What if who you actually are isn't what people expect?" Tyler had asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Frank had been quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Then maybe those people don't know you as well as they think they do," he'd said finally. "Maybe it's time to show them who you really are." The words had hung between them like a challenge, like a permission Tyler hadn't known he needed. He'd felt Frank's eyes on his face, studying his expression in the darkness, and for a moment Tyler had wondered if Frank could see the truth written there, the growing realization that everything Tyler had thought he knew about himself was shifting like sand beneath his feet. It was around this time that Tyler had started noticing things about Frank that he'd never paid attention to before. The way Frank's hands moved when he talked, graceful and expressive. The way his laugh started as a low chuckle in his chest before breaking free into something bright and infectious. The way he smelled like coffee and something clean and masculine that made Tyler want to lean closer whenever they sat together. Tyler had caught himself staring at Frank's mouth during conversations, wondering what it would feel like to kiss him, wondering if Frank's lips were as soft as they looked. The thoughts had terrified him at first, these sudden flashes of desire that came out of nowhere and left him breathless and confused. He tried to push the feelings away, to convince himself that what he was experiencing was just admiration for a good friend, just appreciation for someone who understood him better than anyone else ever had. But the feelings had only grown stronger, more insistent, until Tyler found himself lying awake at night thinking about the way Frank had smiled at him that day, or the way his hand had brushed against Tyler's when they'd reached for the same book. Frank, for his part, had seemed to be going through his own internal struggle. Tyler had noticed him growing more thoughtful, more introspective, often catching him staring into space with a frown of concentration. Their conversations had taken on a different quality, becoming more philosophical, more searching. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Frank had asked one evening as they walked through the city after dinner. Like you're following a script that someone else wrote for you? Tyler had felt his heart skip at the question, recognizing his own feelings reflected in Frank's words. All the time, he'd admitted, especially lately. Frank had stopped walking then, turning to face Tyler under a streetlight. What would you do differently? He'd asked. If you could write your own script? Tyler had looked at Frank standing there, his face half in shadow, his eyes serious and searching, and felt the words he wanted to say lodge in his throat. He'd wanted to say that he would be braver, that he would stop pretending to be someone he wasn't, that he would tell Frank how he felt even if it meant risking everything they'd built together. Instead, he had said, "I don't know, I'm still figuring that out." Frank had nodded like he understood, like he was struggling with the same questions. They'd walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, but Tyler had felt the weight of unspoken words between them, the pressure of truths that neither of them was quite ready to voice. The tension had continued building over the following weeks. Tyler had found himself hyper-aware of every interaction with Frank, analyzing every glance and gesture for hidden meaning. When Frank had complimented his new haircut, Tyler had felt a flush of pleasure that seemed disproportionate to the simple comment. When Frank had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie night, Tyler had spent an hour just watching him sleep, memorizing the peaceful expression on his face and fighting the urge to brush a strand of hair away from his eyes. Jacob had started making jokes about how much time Frank spent at their apartment, teasing that he should just move in and split the rent 3 ways. The comments had made both Tyler and Frank blush and stammer denials, but Tyler had caught Frank looking at him during these exchanges with something that might have been hope in his eyes. The breaking point had come on a rainy Thursday evening when Frank had shown up at the apartment soaked and shivering, having walked across town in an unexpected downpour. Tyler had immediately bustled him inside, wrapping him in towels and insisting he change into dry clothes. "I'll make coffee," Tyler had said, trying not to notice the way Frank's wet t-shirt clung to his chest, trying not to think about the fact that Frank had chosen to come to their apartment instead of going home to his own place. Frank had emerged from the bathroom wearing one of Tyler's sweaters, the soft gray cotton hanging loose on his smaller frame. The sight of Frank in his clothes had done something to Tyler's equilibrium, had made him feel possessive and tender in ways he'd never experienced before. They'd sat on the couch with their coffee, Frank's feet tucked under him, the sweater sleeves covering his hands. "Thank you," Frank had said quietly, "for taking care of me." "Always," Tyler had replied without thinking, and then had felt his face burn as he realized how the words sounded, how much it revealed about his feelings. Frank had looked at him, then with an expression Tyler couldn't quite read, something soft and vulnerable and searching. "Tyler," he'd started to say, but then Jacob had burst through the front door with his usual dramatic flair, breaking the moment and leaving Tyler to wonder what Frank had been about to tell him. That night, Tyler had barely slept. He'd replayed the evening over and over in his mind, focusing on the way Frank had looked in his sweater, the way he'd said Tyler's name like it meant something more than just a way to get his attention. Tyler had found himself wondering what would have happened if Jacob hadn't come home, if that moment of charged silence had been allowed to continue. The next morning, Frank had returned the sweater, freshly washed and folded. "Thanks for letting me borrow this," he'd said, but he'd held on to it for just a moment too long before handing it over, his fingers brushing against Tyler's in a way that felt entirely deliberate. Tyler had buried his face in the sweater after Frank left, breathing in the lingering scent of Frank's cologne mixed with his own laundry detergent. The combination had made his head spin with want and confusion and the growing certainty that what he felt for Frank was far beyond friendship. Over the next few days, Tyler had found himself paying closer attention to Frank's behavior, looking for signs that his feelings might be reciprocated. He'd noticed the way Frank's gaze lingered on his face during conversations, the way he found excuses to touch Tyler's arm or shoulder when making a point. He'd noticed how Frank always positioned himself close to Tyler when they sat together, how their knees would bump and neither of them would move away. But Tyler had also noticed Frank's growing restlessness, the way he seemed to be wrestling with something internal. Frank had started canceling plans at the last minute, claiming work obligations or family commitments. When he did spend time with Tyler, he seemed distracted, like part of his mind was somewhere else entirely. The distance had hurt more than Tyler had expected. He'd grown accustomed to Frank's constant presence, to the easy intimacy of their friendship, and Frank's withdrawal had left him feeling lost and anxious. Tyler had started second-guessing every interaction, wondering if he'd somehow revealed too much, if Frank had figured out his feelings and was pulling away because he didn't reciprocate them. It was during this period of uncertainty that Tyler had thrown himself back into his writing with renewed intensity. The story he'd started had evolved into something deeper and more complex, an exploration of identity and desire and the courage it took to live authentically. He'd written about characters who struggled with societal expectations, who found themselves drawn to people they'd never expected to love, who had to choose between safety and truth. Frank had continued reading each chapter as Tyler finished it, his feedback growing more thoughtful and personal with each installment. "Your protagonist reminds me of myself sometimes," Frank had written after reading a particularly emotional chapter. "The way he's afraid to want what he wants because it doesn't fit with how he's supposed to be." The comment had made Tyler's heart race. He'd stared at Frank's message for a long time, reading between the lines, wondering if Frank was trying to tell him something about his own life, his own struggles with identity and desire. Tyler had crafted his response carefully. "I think we all have parts of ourselves that don't fit the roles we're supposed to play," he'd written back. "The question is whether we're brave enough to honor those parts, even when it's scary." Frank's reply had come back almost immediately. "What if being brave means risking everything that matters to you?" The question had felt like a door opening, like Frank was inviting Tyler into a deeper conversation about things they'd been dancing around for weeks. Tyler had felt his hands shake as he typed his response. "Maybe what matters most is being true to yourself, even if it means everything else has to change." There had been a long pause before Frank's next message. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about truth and change and what it means to really know yourself." Tyler had wanted to call Frank then, to hear his voice and try to understand what he was really saying. But something had held him back, some instinct that told him this conversation needed to happen in person, that whatever Frank was working through required presence and proximity and the kind of honesty that could only happen face to face. The opportunity had come the following weekend when Jacob had gone out of town to visit his parents. Frank had texted Tyler on Saturday morning, asking if he wanted company for the day. Tyler had agreed immediately, his heart racing with anticipation and nervousness about spending extended time alone with Frank. Frank had arrived at the apartment with groceries and a shy smile, announcing his intention to cook dinner for Tyler. "I've been practicing, Mo," he'd said, unpacking ingredients for what looked like an elaborate pasta dish. "Figured it was time I returned the favor for all those meals you've made me." Tyler had watched Frank move around the kitchen with growing fascination. There was something different about him that day, something more relaxed and open than Tyler had seen in weeks. Frank had hummed while he cooked, occasionally asking Tyler to taste something or hand him a utensil, their interactions easy and domestic in a way that made Tyler's chest ache with longing. "This is incredible," Tyler had said when they'd finally sat down to eat. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Frank had blushed slightly. "YouTube, mostly, and my grandmother's recipes. She always said that cooking for someone was a way of showing them you cared about them." The comment had hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them had acknowledged directly. Tyler had felt Frank's eyes on his face as he'd taken another bite, had seen something hopeful and nervous in Frank's expression. After dinner, they'd settled on the couch with Pranane in the pretense of watching a movie. But Tyler had found himself more interested in Frank than in the screen, noting the way the soft light from the television played across his features, the way his hands gestured as he talked about the film's cinematography. "You're not watching," Frank had observed, catching Tyler staring at him instead of the screen. "I'm listening," Tyler had replied, which was true but not complete. He'd been listening to Frank's voice, memorizing the cadence of his speech, the way he got excited when talking about things he was passionate about. Frank had smiled at that, a soft expression that had made Tyler's heart skip. "What are you thinking about?" Frank had asked, his voice dropping to something more intimate. Tyler had felt the weight of the question, the invitation it represented. "I'm thinking about how different everything feels lately," he'd said carefully. How I feel like I'm seeing things more clearly than I have in a long time. What kind of things? Frank had pressed, shifting on the couch so that he was facing Tyler more directly. Tyler had looked at Frank's face in the dim light, noting the way his lips were slightly parted, the way his eyes seemed to be searching Tyler's expression for something specific. I'm thinking about what you said the other night, about living someone else's script, Tyler had said. I think I've been doing that for a long time, pretending to want things I didn't actually want, pretending to be someone I'm not. Frank had nodded slowly. What do you actually want? He'd asked, and there had been something breathless in his voice, like the answer mattered more than Tyler could possibly know. Tyler had felt his courage falter then, the weight of honesty seeming suddenly too heavy to bear. I want to be brave enough to find out, he'd said instead of the truth, which was that he wanted Frank, wanted to know what it would feel like to kiss him, wanted to explore this connection that had been building between them for months. Frank had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. Maybe we could be brave together, he'd said finally, and Tyler had felt something shift in the air between them, some invisible barrier beginning to crumble. They'd talked until late into the night, their conversation meandering through topics both profound and mundane, but always circling back to questions of identity and authenticity and the courage required to live honestly. Tyler had found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, thoughts and fears and dreams that felt too vulnerable to voice but somehow safe to share with Frank. I used to think I had everything figured out, Frank had said as the night wore on, his voice soft with wine and exhaustion. I thought I knew exactly what my life was supposed to look like, what I was supposed to want, but lately I feel like I don't know anything at all. Maybe not knowing is okay, Tyler had replied. Maybe it's better to admit you're confused than to pretend you're certain about things that don't feel right. Frank had looked at him then with an expression so tender and grateful that Tyler had felt his breath catch. How did you get so wise? Frank had asked. And Tyler had wanted to say that it wasn't wisdom, it was just the clarity that came from finally acknowledging the truth about himself. Frank had fallen asleep on the couch that night, curled up against the armrest with Tyler's throw blanket pulled up to his chin. Tyler had watched him sleep for a while, noting the peaceful expression on his face, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheeks. He'd wanted to brush the hair away from Frank's forehead, wanted to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers, but had settled for adjusting the blanket and leaving a glass of water on the coffee table in case Frank woke up thirsty. Tyler had gone to his own bed eventually, but had lain awake thinking about the evening, about the way Frank had looked at him during their conversation, about the loaded silences and meaningful glances that had punctuated their talk. He'd felt like they were on the verge of something momentous, like they were standing at the edge of a cliff and trying to decide whether to jump. The next morning, Frank had been gone when Tyler woke up, leaving only a note thanking him for dinner and the couch. Tyler had felt a stab of disappointment, wondering if Frank was having second thoughts about their conversation, if the intimacy of the previous evening had scared him away. But Frank had texted him later that day, a simple message that had made Tyler's heart race. Thank you for last night, for listening, for understanding. It meant more than you know. Tyler had stared at the message for a long time before responding. Thank you for trusting me with your thoughts. I hope you know you can always talk to me about anything. Frank's reply had come quickly. I know, that's what makes this so complicated. Tyler had wanted to ask what Frank meant by this, wanted to push for clarification about what exactly was complicated. But something had held him back, some instinct that told him Frank needed space to process whatever he was feeling, that pushing too hard might cause him to retreat entirely. Over the following week, Frank had been present but distant, joining Tyler and Jacob for their usual activities, but seeming preoccupied, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. Tyler had caught him staring into space during conversations, had noticed the way he startled when someone said his name, like he'd been lost in thought. Tyler had continued working on his story, pouring his own confusion and longing into his protagonist's journey. The character had reached a turning point in the narrative, Amicio, a moment where he had to choose between safety and truth, between the life he'd always known and the possibility of something real and authentic. Frank had been slower to respond to the latest chapters, and when he did, his feedback had been more personal than ever. "Your character is so brave," he'd written. "I wish I had his courage." Tyler had wanted to tell Frank that he was braver than he knew, that the very fact that he was questioning everything showed a kind of courage that Tyler admired. But instead, he'd written back, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what you need to do despite being terrified." Frank had called him that night, his voice shaky with emotion. "Can I come over?" he'd asked. "I need to talk to someone, and you're the only person who might understand." Tyler had agreed immediately, his heart racing with anticipation and worry. Frank had arrived 20 minutes later, his hair messed from running his hands through it, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think I'm having some kind of crisis," Frank had said, without preamble, pacing around Tyler's living room like a caged animal. "I can't stop thinking about things that don't make sense, wanting things I'm not supposed to want." Tyler had felt his breath catch at the words, recognizing his own struggle reflected in Frank's distress. "What kind of things?" he had asked gently, settling onto the couch and hoping Frank would join him. Frank had stopped pacing then, turning to face Tyler with an expression of such vulnerability that Tyler had felt his heart break a little. "I think I might not be as straight as I thought I was," Frank had said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I think I might be attracted to someone I never expected to be attracted to." The admission had hung between them like a live wire, crackling with possibility and danger. Tyler had felt his pulse quicken, hope and terror warring in his chest as he tried to process what Frank was telling him. "That's not a crisis," Tyler had said carefully. "That's just self-discovery." Frank had laughed then, a sound caught between relief and hysteria. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one whose entire understanding of yourself just got turned upside down." Tyler had wanted to tell Frank that he understood more than Frank could possibly know, that he'd been going through his own process of self-discovery, his own reckoning with desires that didn't fit the script he'd been following. But something had held him back, some instinct that told him this moment was about Frank's journey, not his own. "Tell me about this person," Tyler had said instead, his voice carefully neutral, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "This someone you're attracted to." Frank had collapsed onto the couch then, burying his face in his hands. "It's so complicated," he'd said, his voice muffled. "This person is important to me, really important. I can't risk losing them." Tyler had felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, wondering who Frank was talking about, who had captured his attention and his heart. "Why would you lose them?" Tyler had asked. "If they're really important to you, wouldn't they want you to be honest about your feelings?" Frank had looked up at Tyler then, his eyes searching Tyler's face like he was looking for something specific. "What if being honest changes everything?" Frank had asked. "What if it ruins the best relationship I've ever had?" Tyler had felt his breath catch at the intensity in Frank's voice, at the way he was looking at Tyler like the answer to his question mattered more than anything else in the world. "What if not being honest ruins it instead?" Tyler had asked. "What if this person feels the same way, and you're both just too scared to say anything?" Frank had been quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Tyler's face. "You really think that's possible?" he'd asked, and there had been something hopeful and terrified in his voice. "I think anything is possible," Tyler had replied, his own voice barely above a whisper. "I think people surprise each other all the time." Frank had shifted on the couch then, moving closer to Tyler until their knees were almost touching. "Tyler," he'd said, and there had been something different in the way he'd said Tyler's name, something tender and questioning and full of possibility. "Yeah," Tyler had managed, his heart racing so fast he was sure Frank could hear it. "I think you might be the person I'm attracted to," Frank had said, the words so quiet Tyler almost missed them. "I think I might be falling in love with you." The confession had hit Tyler like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his vision blur with sudden tears. He'd stared at Frank's face, noting the way his cheeks had flushed red, the way his hands were trembling slightly where they rested on his knees. "Frank," Tyler had whispered, and the sound of his own voice had surprised him with its tenderness, its certainty. "I've been in love with you for months." Frank's eyes had widened at the admission, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Really?" he'd asked, and Tyler had nodded, reaching out to take Frank's hands in his own. "Really, Tyler," confirmed, marveling at how right it felt to finally say the words out loud, to finally acknowledge the truth that had been growing between them for so long. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you without ruining everything." Frank had laughed then, a sound of pure relief and joy. "We're both idiots," he'd said, squeezing Tyler's hands. "We've been dancing around this for months, when we could have just been honest from the beginning." "Maybe we needed time to figure ourselves out first," Tyler had suggested. "Maybe we had to be ready to hear the truth before we could speak it." Frank had nodded, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. "Can I kiss you?" he'd asked, and Tyler had felt his heart stop and restart at the simple question. "Please," Tyler had whispered, and Frank had leaned forward, his hands coming up to cup Tyler's face as their lips met for the first time. The kiss had been everything Tyler had imagined and nothing like he'd expected. Soft and tentative at first, then deeper as they'd both relaxed into the moment, into the reality of finally being able to touch each other the way they'd both been wanting to for so long. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Frank had rested his forehead against Tyler's. "Wow," he'd whispered, and Tyler had laughed, feeling giddy and lightheaded with happiness. "Yeah," Tyler had agreed. "Wow." They'd talked until dawn that night, sharing stories about their respective journeys of self-discovery, about the moments when they'd each realized their feelings, about the fear and hope that had been driving them both. Tyler had told Frank about ending things with Sandra, about the way their friendship had made him question everything he'd thought he knew about himself. Frank had shared his own struggles with identity and expectation, his growing certainty that what he felt for Tyler was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. "I was so scared you'd think I was crazy," Frank had admitted as the sun began to rise outside Tyler's windows. "I kept thinking that maybe I was just confused, that maybe I was projecting feelings that weren't really there. I was terrified you'd figure out how I felt and run away," Tyler had replied, stroking Frank's hair as they lay curled together on the couch. "I thought I was being so obvious, but I guess we were both too caught up in our own fears to see what was right in front of us." Frank had tilted his head up to look at Tyler, his eyes soft with affection and wonder. "What happens now?" he'd asked. "I mean, I know what I want to happen, but this is all so new for me." Tyler had considered the question, thinking about the practical implications of what they were starting, the conversations they'd need to have, the adjustments they'd both need to make. "I think we take it one day at a time," he'd said finally. "I think we figure it out together." Frank had smiled at that, the expression so bright and beautiful that Tyler had felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I like the sound of that," Frank had said, "figuring it out together." They'd spent the rest of that weekend in a bubble of new intimacy, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, marveling at how natural it felt to be together in this new way. Frank had been amazed by his own responses, by how right it felt to kiss Tyler, to hold him, to wake up next to him. "I can't believe I spent so many years not knowing this about myself," Frank had said on Sunday evening as they'd cooked dinner together. "I feel like I've been living in black and white, and suddenly everything is in color." Tyler had understood exactly what Frank meant. His own experience of self-discovery had been similar, a gradual awakening to possibilities he'd never considered, desires he'd never acknowledged. But having Frank beside him, having someone who understood the journey because he was on it too, made everything feel less frightening and more like an adventure. They'd had to navigate the practical aspects of their new relationship, of course. Frank had needed to have difficult conversations with his family about his sexuality, about the fact that he was dating Tyler. Tyler had needed to tell his own parents, to explain why he was suddenly with a man after years of dating women. Some of those conversations had gone better than others. Frank's parents had struggled initially, needing time to adjust their expectations and understanding. Tyler's family had been more accepting, though they'd asked a lot of questions about when Tyler had known, how long he'd been questioning his sexuality. "I think I always knew, on some level," Tyler had told his mother during one of their phone conversations. "I just wasn't ready to acknowledge it until I met Frank. He made me brave enough to be honest with myself." Jacob had been thrilled when they'd finally told him about their relationship, claiming he'd been waiting months for them to figure it out. "You two were so obvious," he'd said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "I was starting to think I'd have to lock you in a closet together to get you to admit your feelings." The comment had made both Tyler and Frank blush and laugh, but it had also highlighted how natural their connection had seemed to outside observers, how right they were together in ways that even they hadn't fully recognized. 3 months later, Tyler sat on his couch with Frank pressed close against his side, marveling at how much had changed and how perfectly everything had fallen into place. Frank's confession about missing how they used to talk had been his way of acknowledging that their relationship had evolved beyond their old friendship, that they'd entered new territory that required different kinds of communication, different levels of honesty. "I miss it too," Tyler said, responding to Frank's earlier comment. "But I think what we have now is better than what we used to have. More honest, more real." Frank turned to look at Tyler, his eyes soft with affection and contentment. "You're right," he said. "We used to talk around our feelings. Now we can talk about them directly." Tyler smiled, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to Frank's forehead. "What do you want to talk about?" he asked. Frank's answering smile was radiant, full of love and possibility, and the kind of joy that came from finally being exactly where you belonged. "Everything," he said. "I want to talk about everything with you." And as they settled back against the couch cushions, Tyler's arm around Frank's shoulders, both of them finally comfortable with the closeness they'd been craving for months, Tyler realized that Frank was right. They had everything to talk about, a whole lifetime of conversations ahead of them, and all the time in the world to figure out their future together. The movie continued playing on the television, forgotten and unimportant compared to the quiet miracle of their togetherness, the simple joy of being able to sit this close, to touch without hesitation, to love each other openly and honestly. Tyler thought about the story he'd been writing, about his protagonist's journey toward authenticity and courage, and realized that sometimes the best stories were the ones you lived yourself, the ones that surprised you with their beauty and their truth. Frank shifted against him, getting more comfortable, and Tyler felt a wave of gratitude wash over him for all the moments that had led them here, for all the courage they'd both found to be honest about their feelings, for the love that had grown between them despite their fears and uncertainties. This was what happiness felt like, Tyler realized. Not the performative contentment he'd felt with Sandra, not the hollow satisfaction of living up to other people's expectations, but this deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where and with whom he belonged. Frank's hand found his in the darkness, their fingers intertwining naturally, and Tyler squeezed gently, a silent promise of all the conversations still to come, all the discoveries still to make, all the love still to share.